We'll be opening today's edition of Talking Point, ladies and gentlemen, with these latest happenings in Israel, where as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seeks to expand his war in Gaza by invading southern Lebanon on Tuesday evening. We saw Iran, which fired about 400 ballistic missiles into a southern and central Israel. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, acronym the IRGC, said in a statement that if Israel responds to the attack, it would be followed by more destructive strikes. On Tuesday, Iran said that its supreme leader made a decision of firing dozens of missiles into Israel as a retaliation for Israel's invasion of Lebanon, as well as the assassination of top Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, The Guardian reported. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said that the attack was a decisive response to the aggression of the Zionist regime and warned the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Iran is not belligerent but stands firmly against any threat. In response, we have seen Israel that has declared the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres persona non grata for his response in the Iran attack. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall equally be taking you in the course of today's edition of the program, and now to the African continent in Nigeria, where we shall be focusing on the economic impasse plaguing the West African country, where for the second time in 2 months, angry protesters in several cities across Nigeria trooped out to denounce a biting economic hardship in the West African country and called for change. Nigeria has been with an economic impasse or economic crisis in several years, triggered by the removal of the full subsidy, insecurity, governance and much more, which has caused an inflation hike, for price hikes as well as currency devaluation. What is troubling or truly crumbling Nigeria's economy? Join us in the course of today's edition of Talking Point. Stay with us. Hello, fervent televiewers and listeners of For You Media Africa. You're welcome to today's edition of Talking Point. Well, like we mentioned in our preamble, we shall be focusing on our opening topic this day, which will lead us all the way to Israel to focus on the Iranian attack that took place just in the night of Tuesday, October 1st, 2024, where we saw hundreds of missiles being fired to Israel in retaliation for the assassination of the leaders of Hezbollah as well as Hamas, and equally the leader of the Guard Corps. Well, meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, before we dig deep, why we shall be equally focusing on Nigeria to discuss today's topics of discussion. All the way from the United States, we've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, a Pan-Africanist, economist, and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you, Sharon, for having me, and thank my co-panelists for joining as well.
Equally, to evoke what's happening in Nigeria, as well as relating it with what's happening on the African continent, we've been joined by HASSAN TAIWO SOWETO, National Coordinator for Education's Rights Campaign, which joins us all the way from Lagos. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you this day on the program. To debut today's opening topic, which is focusing on Israel with this latest happenings. So we saw after the Hezbollah leader was assassinated, we saw Iran that had vowed to respond or retaliate towards Israel as far as the crisis in the Middle East is concerned. But later on, we saw a leader or an expert in the Middle East that stated that the killing of the Hezbollah leader was going to result in a chain of destruction in the global level. But then, what is your analysis, Dr. FONGOD, of this recent happening which was seen in the Middle East, given that as of now, the Secretary General of the United Nations has just been declared persona non grata?
Well, I think that in most ways, Israel will have to do what Israel has to do to be able to defend, her natural sovereignty. this is an age-old question. What will Israel do in defense of herself? So the reality is we're dealing with not just a geopolitical issue, this is also a religious war as well. And Iran has a mandate, was on the mandate based upon Iran and the Ayatollah, is that Israel should cease to exist as a nation. And obviously, I think that the recent attacks that took place that precipitated all the events that happened subsequently in Israel is a testament to what is it that the Islamic nation is up to so far as Israel is concerned. I'm too not so much concerned about that for now. Reasons being that there are so many key players. I think you're looking at a country like Russia that is aligning closely with Iran. Obviously, the United States is aligning closely with Israel, and so you are basically looking at maybe some kind of a proxy war that is taking place in the Middle East. And if there was ever going to be a third world war, I think that we are quite ripe for it, and that will obviously be taking place, in the Middle East. The Middle East will be the epicenter of it all, some kind of a catechism or some kind of a biblical proportion. So that will be firmly in the Middle East. That being said, I think on the African continent, the only issues that we might be facing out here so far as that those conflicts are concerned is that we depend heavily on oil that is coming in from the Middle East and petroleum products. So we will have to face those consequences as well. I'm also afraid that countries like Libya, Sudan, all those countries, north of the Sahara will have to probably, be drawn into this because Iran has a lot of proxy, all over the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm afraid that if care is not being taken to basically curb this level of violence and rhetoric, we might be pulled into something else that we have no business being pulled into.
Absolutely, and of course, it's worth noting that in recent years, Iran has actually, so to say, Israel has gained enemies in the Middle East region. And like you mentioned, this is some sort of proxy war. And I'll direct this next question to you, Mr. Hassan. Now, given that the African continent, your co-panelist stated that this war could exhibit a third world war, and of course, the Middle East could be at the center of this war. But then, looking at the context of the African continent, Africa has its own challenges. You're from Nigeria that is dealing with its own crisis. How can Africa brace itself against the repercussions of some of these wars that are taking place out of the continent of Africa?
Well, thank you very much for that question. But it's important to say that what is happening in the Middle East is not exactly different, from the context of what is happening in Africa, because you also have in Africa a situation whereby on the basis of the history of colonialism, but also the continuous exploitation of the resources of Africa by the multinational companies, you have existing in Africa also a situation whereby Africa is being run like a client state of the global powers. And from the point of view of what is happening across the world today, there's equally the possibility that you could have an explosion of crisis of a certain kind of a proxy war between the global powers also happening or breaking out in Africa. You've seen the extreme competition between Putin's Russia and the United States and other Western global powers for control, of different states in Africa, some of which, has led to some of the coups that you have seen in the past period in West Africa as well as in the Sahel. So I think from that point of view that, the challenge for Africa is not just about the blowback of the crisis you have in the Middle East, but even whether Africa itself will not become a sort of, a place for a proxy war between the different competing imperialist powers. And what this means, from the point of view of preparation, is that Africa needs to liberate itself from the clutches of global imperialism. We need a revolution in Africa to take control of the resources of Africa from the multinational companies, but also, most importantly, from the capitalist elite in Africa, who are more or less like slaves, of the imperialist powers. As many of the regimes we have in Africa today, whether civilian regimes or military regimes, are merely surviving on the basis of patronage by the different global imperialist powers. Even in Cameroon, for instance, what has kept the dictatorship going on for decades isn't so much because of the power of the regime itself, but because, you have French imperialism, backing it up. So from that point of view, we need an uprising in Africa, against the local ruling elite, but most importantly also the imperialist backers, to take control of the wealth of the continent, to establish a workers' and people's government in each of the countries that can ensure that you have a socialist plan of the economy, that you nationalize the key sectors of the continent economy, in order to release the huge wealth that each country in Africa has, to be able to begin to sort out the problems of poverty, of diseases, of wars and pestilence that affect different countries in Africa. So I think that the road of revolution, a socialist revolution, is actually the only pathway for Africa, to be able to prevent cataclysm from breaking out in the continent, and for Africa to be able to find progress for itself and its people in the coming period.
Absolutely, thank you immensely, Hassan. And now to proceed with you, Dr. Fongod, you listen to what Hassan had to say, which is in line with my next question. Of course, Africa can brace itself against the repercussions of this war, but then you cited earlier on that we have countries like Israel, Iran, that have been backed by different powers. Now, in the wake of that, we saw the Iranian foreign minister that came out recently, that was today, stating that the United States should not interfere in what's happening between Iran as well as Israel. But then away from that, the United States has been in support of Israel for the longest of time, as far as we saw that in the war against Gaza, in the war in Gaza and others. But then do you believe that there's numerous conflicts? Because we have seen leaders in the northern African region, especially countries like Egypt, that have played a key role in trying to bring about calm in say the Middle East. Do you believe that this numerous conflict could some sort of degenerate beyond the region?
Absolutely. I think that while we are talking about the Middle East, we need to firmly understand that we are already fighting a proxy war on the African continent in relationship to what Russia and Ukraine are doing. The assassination, the killing of some of the Wagner soldiers in places like Mali was as a result of the help that came from Ukraine, to the proxy groups that they had in Mali to be able to attack Russian soldiers on African soil. This is already taking place. Some of the equipments that were heading out to Ukraine from the United States ended up on African soil. We are already facing that. The question is not the question is not if this will happen. It's all about when, this will, hold sway fully on the African continent. We have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we fully understand we cannot be pulled into this. And there is no reason, for Africa to put herself in harm's way in relationship trying to support one group or the other, irrespective of whatever your political ideology, philosophical persuasion or religious persuasions might be. I could care less. On the African continent, we have to look out to what is to the best interest of the African, has an Afrocentric mindset, an Afrocentric perspective, so that we do not get pulled into something else that we have no business being pulled into. If you think that this will end up in the Middle East, first of all, the Middle East, just a couple of years ago, used to be considered part of Africa. Without the Suez Canal, we'll be talking about foot soldiers crossing from the Middle East into Africa, unrestricted. So we have to be able to make sure that we do whatever it takes to make sure that this does not happen. So those are some of the issues that we are facing, and those are some of the pains that we have to navigate so that Africa is not drawn into something else that she has no business getting into.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fongod. To proceed with you, Hassan, you listened to your co-panelists. What's your take on that?
Well, it's very correct to say that Africa should not allow itself to be pulled into a war it knows nothing about. But how do we achieve that is what I think is equally very important, because in a sense, the world is a global village. Economically, whatever happens, in the US can have impact in Africa. Whatever happens in Africa can have impact as far away as China. And that's also why it is when it comes to wars, when it comes to diseases. We saw the COVID-19 pandemic, how it broke out across the world. So in that sense, it means that even when we say Africa should not be drawn into a war it has no reason to be part of, there's a way in which we also have to say, how would that happen? And I think that Africa has to first and foremost liberate itself, from its own corrupt rulers who are in the pocket of the global imperialist powers and who would not mind to support either side in the war so far their own interests are protected. That is one thing. Then the second thing is that Africa also must offer solidarity, to the working people in the Middle East who are going to be affected by the war. Because when you look at the crisis in the Middle East, particularly between Israel and Palestine, it is difficult, to say that you want to take one side or the other, because the reality is that you have on both sides, of the conflict, working class people who have got everything to lose as the war continues to intensify, and who are not responsible for the kind of division and hatred that has been infused to the conflict over the decade. Because the creation of the Israeli state itself is a product, the injustice that exists, when you are talking about the global imperialist powers and all of that. And that has created over the decades, for instance, a certain sense of outrage in Palestine and the Middle East. But at the end of the day, if you are going to solve this kind of conflict, it means that the working class on both sides, the people on both sides have to come to a form of agreement. Because you can't come to an agreement on that kind of conflict by saying that one side should give away their homeland for the other. It's impossible to have that kind of solution, given how you have had intermarriages and all of that over the decades. So it means that you need a solution that can be forged on the basis of unity, on the basis of common understanding, something which the ruling elite of both sides do not seem capable to be able to provide, because their own interest is completely linked to the continuation of the hostility. Don't forget that last year, when the war broke out, the Netanyahu government in Israel was almost, at the point of being wiped out by developing mass opposition in Israel itself. The war with Palestine appears to be what has given it a new lease of life, because they can use that war to continue to create the impression that the regime is still required, the regime is still valid, the regime still has a role to play in defending the security of the Israeli people, whereas that same regime implements neoliberal policies that continues to affect the lives of ordinary Israelis themselves. So what that therefore means is that there's a need for the working class on both sides to close ranks. And what Africa can do in that respect is to offer solidarity for the working masses on both sides, and then Africa must also be able to put forward a clear proposal as to how unity can be forged and a real solution can be provided for the crisis in the Middle East. Because if that crisis continues, inevitably, it's going to become a global war that will affect the economy of the entire world, that will affect the people of the entire world. So I think that Africa can play this kind of role, but we can only play it if we liberate ourselves from the clutches of the rulers that exist in this part of the world, who are in the pocket of the global imperialist powers.
Thank you so much, Hassan. And now to conclude this opening topic with you, Dr. FONGOD, you got the recommendations of your co-panelists. Now, in that regard, we've seen the Israeli foreign or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that stated that Israel was going to react as far as this attack is concerned. But moving forward, what suggestions can you make as far as these latest developments in the Middle East is concerned?
Well, to the African, because obviously that's all we can be able to do. I think that we have to fully make sure that we build up our industries on the African continent and stop importing everything that we do from the outside. The Middle East is where we get all our petroleum products from, and so we really must make sure that we reduce that, build up refineries on the African continent that will be able to service the areas of petroleum products on the African continent, so that we don't have to keep importing, petroleum products. And in most cases, like in the case of Nigeria, where we keep exporting crude oil and then importing petroleum products, that's quite crazy. I think that we need to be able to find ways in which to stop that, and then just build up our local economy so that somewhat we can be able to depend, on locally made goods and products on the continent of Africa. The reality is this, that what we are talking about so far as the Middle East is concerned is we're talking about, conflicts that are generations old. And it is virtually impossible for us to even sit and start talking about what is and what can be. And the reason for that is because you're looking at the conflict that is enshrined in religion. One of the most difficult conversations to have with anyone is somebody who is quite religious in nature. Reasons being, it is so difficult to talk to somebody who tells you what God is saying rather than when logic and common sense comes into play. So for me, so far as I'm concerned, I'm thinking that if there was ever going to be a time in which we fully understand that if there be any other religion that is meaningful, it's humanity. Long before there was Islam, long before there was Christianity, long before we ever thought about looking to the skies or looking to the soil, the mountains, so the valleys, whatever we look to so far as trying to gain some kind of recognition with the superpower or the supernatural, whatever it is, we were humans first. And when every child is born, that child is not born, even if you're born into a Muslim family or you're born into a Christian family, that child is not born as a Muslim, is not born as a Christian. The first religion of that child is humanity. I think that the day we lose our humanity, religion will be able to save us. And I think that what's going on in the Middle East is the fact that we have lost our humanity, and we are talking about, the levels of pain and chaos that we see daily in places like Gaza, Israel's kids being murdered, just horrendous stuff. So yes, we're putting an end to that. This is what I'm thinking. If we will love our children more than we hate our enemies, if we will love our children more than we hate our enemies, in my opinion, I think that these wars will come to an end, because nobody wants to lose their child senselessly to any kind of war or any ideology, be it religious or not. But I fear I'm too late for that.
Absolutely, and of course it will be time for the leaders or the stakeholders involved to prioritize peace and the stability of the region, and Africa would have to take its own interests at heart. Ladies and gentlemen, away from that burning issue in the Middle East, we shall be focusing now, without any transition, what's happening in the West African nation of Nigeria. We earlier on mentioned in our preamble that, of course, the West African country, which we know for some time has been struggling with an economic impasse, is the time we saw yesterday, which was October 1st, 2024, which coincides with the country's celebration of its 64 years of independence, where we saw Nigerians that took to the streets of Lagos, of Abuja, as well as other key states across the West African country to protest against what the term crumbling economy. And of course, we are discussing that in the course of today's edition of Talking Point. And to debut today's conversation, as far as that topic of discussion is concerned, I would debut with you, Mr. Hassan TAIWO, who is our representative, or better still, will join us all the way from Nigeria. Now, Mr. Hassan, at the center of these numerous protests, which we have seen, given that this is not the first, what we saw yesterday and the earlier hours of today is not the first that's happening. We saw equally in August, we saw it in July, and previous years across the West African country, still in relation to some of the challenges that Nigeria is facing. But then, what's your assessment of the current situation plaguing Nigeria?
Starvation really is what we are witnessing in Nigeria today. Millions of people are struggling to feed themselves and their family, and that is because of the escalating cost of commodities, of fuel, of electricity, as well as the collapsing currency, which came about as a result of government policies that were implemented to try and reform the economy, but those policies have ended up ruining the lives of millions of people. Businesses are collapsing, wages have frozen because of the collapsing currency. Vast majority of the people are just living from hand to mouth. Many people are beginning to just take their lives, committing suicide, because they see no way out of the crisis they are in, because individual families are in debt either to banks or to the loan sharks, where they have gone to borrow money and then they've not got anything to pay back. So this is a very desperate situation that faces the country today, and it all started as a continuation, of the economic reforms that the previous administration of President Bola and President Muhammadu Buhari started in 2015. In 2023, last year, when President Bola Ahmed Tinubu took over from President Buhari, he escalated the economic reforms by going directly, for the removal of an important aspect of Nigeria's economy called fuel subsidy. Fuel subsidy is the amount paid by Nigeria to take care of the differences between the price of crude oil when it goes out to Europe, for refinement, and it's brought back to Nigeria. Nigeria is an oil-producing country, but for decades the country has not been able to ensure that it has refineries that can refine its crude oil. So oftentimes crude oil from Nigeria will be sent out to Europe to be refined, but when the product is brought back to Nigeria, because of how it has gone through the different economic jurisdictions over there, because of the higher value of dollar, by the time the fuel product comes back to Nigeria, it costs a fortune that average Nigerian consumers are not able to afford it. So over the decades, what the Nigerian elites have done is to pay a portion of the amount that the fuel product is meant to cost in order to keep the price at the petrol station at a level that many people can be able to afford. But then last year, on May 29, the current president of Nigeria decided to wipe off this subsidy, something which means that the Nigerians now have to pay the full value of the price of petroleum products as they are coming from abroad. And on the basis of the weak economy that Nigeria has and the weak purchasing power, it means that the vast majority of the population can no more afford it. Now, the role that crude oil plays in Nigeria's economy is so vast. Apart from the fact that crude oil is one of the sources of revenue for the Nigerian government and also sources of foreign exchange, oil also plays a lot of roles for the Nigerian people. It is what is used to power vehicles for those who own cars. Is what is used to power industries. But beyond that is that because of the crumbling electricity sector, many Nigerian households also depend on kerosene, for instance. Many Nigerian households depend, for instance, on petrol to be able to power generators in order to light their homes, because the electric sector has crumbled, and Nigeria is not able to ensure that there is enough supply of electricity to different homes. So people have to use generators, to compensate, for that. And that also therefore means that when you don't even have cars, you need fuel for your generator, either to power your home or your small business. Then kerosene is used by millions of Nigerian households for cooking, because only very few Nigerian households can actually afford the cost of cooking gas, which is also at a very high rate today. The cooking gas is one of the most expensive products in the country today. So millions of poor households still use the local kerosene stove to cook their meals, which means that they need to buy kerosene, which is also very expensive today. So in that sense, the removal of fuel subsidy has had a very debilitating impact on the different segments of Nigerian society. That's affected businesses, it has affected households, it has affected people's livelihood. So in a sense, it has stopped, life has more or less stopped for average Nigerian people since the fuel subsidy was removed. Because what happened immediately was that the fuel price went up by over 1,000%, and many people cannot afford it. And this has also affected the cost of commodities. It has affected the wages of the Nigerian people, and that is why people are living in a desperate condition today. So that is the situation in Nigeria that is producing the kind of protests that we have seen in the past period. Nigerian people are saying that enough is enough. These policies are not helping them. They need these policies to be reviewed and reversed. But the president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu government, continue to insist that these policies are the only way to go. But the Nigerian people will not take any of that, because reforms are meant, to help the people. Reforms are meant to produce positive results. But these reforms have gone on, for 1.5 years now, going to 2 years, and all they have done is to increase the poverty of the people. Meanwhile, for the rich and for those in power, for politicians, their lives continue, to go on as usual. In fact, over the past few months, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has bought himself a new luxurious vehicle for his official use. He has bought a new yacht, for his official use. He has bought a new private jet for his official use. And as at this morning, the president has jetted off abroad for an annual leave. This will be the second or third time he's going on annual leave alone this year. All of these, luxurious outings and visitations abroad are being paid for by the wealth of Nigeria. So when the same president who is able to use the wealth of Nigeria to do this for himself and his family now says that Nigeria does not have enough money, to pay for fuel subsidy, Nigeria does not have enough money, to provide free education, then people cannot believe that, because it's obvious that this money, this wealth is there, but the ruling elite and the government do not want to spend it for the people. They only want to spend it for themselves. So that is what is happening in Nigeria at the moment.
Thank you so much, Hassan. That was a very well unpacked, or very packed contribution there. And now to proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD, you're an economist, and you listen to your co-panelists detailing what's happening in the West African country. As of now, we've seen these endless calls in Nigeria for the government, the federal government under the Tinubu administration, to be able to resolve this current or economic crisis that is plaguing the West African country. Recall that this is not the first time. He cited that equally happened during the reign or tenure of the former President Muhammadu Buhari. With what's happening in Nigeria, now from your economist point of view, what do you think, or what's at the origin of this crumbling economy in Nigeria? Why is the economy crumbling despite these numerous calls? I recall that in a recent interview, we saw the Dangote CEO, we're talking of Aliko Dangote, that said it was time for the government of Nigeria to scrap off the fuel subsidy. Given that productions at his refineries were going to be able to help the federal government save up some 40% of what he initially spent in actually bringing back the fuel to the country. So why is Nigeria's economy crumbling in spite of all these numerous calls for the federal government to be able to take measures that will benefit the simple or local Nigerian?
Well, I think that I would like to take the position of Mr. Soweto and state that I'd rather be with Buhari this morning, why the country is, Tinubu rather, why the country is crumbling. I need to be on vacation as well with him, so, and that's the problem we have on the African continent. So maybe I need to find myself wherever he went to, maybe Mr. Soweto should tell us if he's in Europe, wherever he is, because obviously he's not in Kaduna, he's not in, I don't think it's in Oyo, all right? So that vacation is not taking place anywhere on the African continent, it's taking place in the West, which is how demented we as African leaders are, because obviously whatever is in our consciousness is the fact that we can be out of the continent and we can travel to some first world nation, developed nation, and then try to be able to have this illusion that we are successful. Meanwhile, the only one place we have been given responsibility over is burning, is in arches. But here's the problem with Nigeria. Nigeria dependence on oil is a major problem. So the Nigerian economy, they export close to about 90%, all right? So all of their petroleum products actually goes out on export. And the problem with that is that the government relies, I think that's about 50% of all of the government's revenue. What that means in essence is this: because they export so much oil and they also import almost every single thing else, especially including all the petroleum products, that gets heavy on the exchange rate, because the country in itself now has to depend heavily on bringing in the GDP. Part of the GDP is actually how much is in the exchange reserve. So if the exchange reserve is high, and which happens when they sell oil, but when they bring in every single thing else, they eat up a lot of that exchange reserve, and that basically does not look good for the economy. And this began taking place around 2015, 2016, when the world oil prices basically dropped. Things were not working in favor of Nigeria, and because every single thing else in everyone in Nigeria depended, we have to be able to sell our oil. We need to be able to do this. The pandemic of 2020 did not help as well. That became a major problem, and so this is a cascading effect that began from that time. And what we have right now is that you have a country where, if you look at its GDP, that is the highest on the continent of Africa. Actually, I think Nigeria has the highest GDP on the continent. The GDP basically will look at it's an economic performance. You're looking at how much money the country is generating in terms of how much oil she's selling, and then you're looking at the bulk of whatever is in the reserve, which really, as of this particular point in time, if you are any foreign national company, you might not be looking at Nigeria, especially when it comes in terms of selling anything in Nigeria, because there are no dollars you're going to get in exchange for whatever value you're providing. That is why major airline companies, right now, flying to Nigeria demand that they have to be paid in dollar. They are not looking for naira, because you have no idea when you will be able to get that money out of Nigeria. So this is the setup. You have a lot of naira in Nigeria, and there is very few dollars, because dollars is the currency of exchange for international market. So as a result of that basically pushing the whole inflation issues, where you have a lot of naira competing, for very limited amount of dollars. And so the inflation goes up, and now it affects every other area in the society. If you listen to what Mr. Soweto just said, almost every single area in society is affected, obviously because of our dependence solely on foreign imports. Now, the only thing that we're having difficulties with right now is the food prices in Nigeria will not be high, and the reason for that is because we are producing most of what we consume in Nigeria, but we are still importing a lot of food from outside of the country, be it things like fruit juice concentrate, the list goes on. If we were able to make sure that someone like the Dangote refinery produces her capacity and then sell that in Nigeria, not in the dollar, with the naira, it's going to drastically reduce fuel prices. I think fuel prices in Nigeria will drop by half. That eventually will also help the farmers and those in the transportation industry to be able to cut prices, and so that the final goods that gets to the marketplace as fair value, so the average Nigerian is not suffering from this chaos that is taking place. We have to find ways to diversify the economy, and if we do not diversify the economy and get a lot into areas of agriculture and manufacturing and only depend on oil and think that we're going to import everything into the country, that will become a major problem. Do I support fuel subsidy? Absolutely not. I think that fuel subsidy makes no sense. If you look at how much Nigeria owes in terms of her debts, it is probably about $115 billion US, I think, and fuel subsidies alone account for some ridiculous about $10 billion US. That's just how much they spend on fuel subsidy annually. They can be able to collect that particular money and pay down their debt. So servicing that debt of $115 billion US is not easy. But if we're able to make sure that we stop fuel subsidy, that is $10 billion US, and use that $10 billion for to build up infrastructures, to bring in machineries, to basically lend money to the private sector and allow young entrepreneurs to get into the marketplace and build robust industries and develop the economy, that will basically curve out the 33-point-something% of young people who are unemployed in Nigeria. That might drop that unemployment rate to close to maybe about 6 to 7%. If only we can be able, just 2 cycles alone of no fuel subsidy, taking that particular money and pushing it in the economy, we will see that the rate of unemployment in Nigeria will basically drop. Here is the kicker. Once ever we talk about the Human Development Index, which is basically how people feel, their happiness, whether there's healthcare, whether humans, those in Nigeria are able to just love the environment in which they are living in because they have access to healthcare, life expectancy is high. Once we look at the the Human Development Index in Nigeria, that is very low. If we look at the economic outlook, okay, the issue is that you're looking at performance, something like GDP, it's okay. It looks great, it's the highest on the continent, but that in itself is quite deceptive because it does not say what is happening to the people. We must be able to use what I have always pushed for, but nobody seems to be buying this, is actually the Human Economic Index. We must be able to combine that Human Development Index plus the economic performance to find out, to have this marrying point. We cannot think about the country basically producing this much revenue and looking very good, but meanwhile the people within the country are dying. There has to be a way in which we look at not just the economic performance, but we also look at the Human Development Index. Yes. But if we combine that together, I think we can come up with something like the Human Economic Performance that basically tells us how the people are feeling in a particular nation and what the economic performance is like. And unfortunately, if you look at Nigeria today, despite the fact that her GDP is the highest in the nation, there are people protesting on the streets because, you know, there is just no way, you know, they are living. I mean, the fuel prices in Nigeria is crazy. I remember I was in Lagos not long ago, and before things really got crazy, I showed up in Lagos. I was at the airport. I put out $100, went to an exchange point, and I wanted to get the local currency. So I gave the lady my $100, and I was kind of in a hurry because I had another flight to catch, and I was telling her, please, can you just hurry? You know, I really need to move so that I can not be late for my other flight. And she told me, yes, she's doing the best that she can. And so she kept counting this money, and she kept counting and counting, and I'm asking myself, what are you doing? What's going on? And then, please, can you just hurry? And then she looks at me, she says, wait a minute, the money I'm actually counting is yours. I gave this lady $100, and the amount of money I received make no sense. I was actually scared of carrying that amount of money, thinking that, you know, some folks might follow me thinking I'm carrying $1 billion. It was just $100. That was like 125,000 naira, which I later learned she actually, you know, that was not even the real value. So in reality, when you get an economy like the one that we presently have in Nigeria, where every single thing else is falling apart, the exchange rate is crazy because we wage everything against the dollar. I don't know why we do that. We have to do that because we are basically trading internationally. We must find ways in which we build the economy within. Make sure that our refineries in Nigeria are running well. Make sure that the economic sector, the agricultural sector is doing what the agricultural sector is supposed to do. Make sure we get into manufacturing and get a lot of people working. The reasons why you have a 33%, you know, of unemployment in any country will be protest any day, anytime. So we have to be able to find a way to cut that down. And the only way to cut that down is not going to give people money. You have to make sure that they're productive. Build up the industries. Make sure that the local industries are developed so that we can be able to hire, you know, these young people and put them to work.
Exactly, Dr. FONGOD, just to highlight, of course, like what you've said, it's time for Nigeria to actually take its own destiny into its hands towards curbing this plague which is hovering over the West African country. And now to you, Mr. Soweto, you listen to what your co-panelists had to say. Of course, he cited a lot of points. I watched in one of your interviews, I think during the press conference that took place on Sunday, you stated amongst your colleagues that the aim of the protest, the aim of the protest why Nigerians had to go to the streets was because of the repercussions of the economic impasse. You equally cited the issue of currency devaluation, which Nigeria faces, which is in line with what your co-panelists had to say. I recall equally that Aliko Dangote, during that said interview, had mentioned that the production at the Dangote refineries was going to go a long way in easing the pressure on the dollar, or better still on the naira, in a bid to say stabilize the economy, stabilize the market. Given your own ground, do you believe, is there a possibility of Nigeria actually getting back on track amidst these numerous challenges?
Well, it's possible. There's always the possibility that Nigeria can get over its challenges. Because if that were not the case, this country would have crumbled a long time ago.
Absolutely.
Nigeria is a country that has been on the brink for years. Predictions by international organizations about how long the country had before it to collapse. And yet the country has managed to continue to exist. That shows that there is actually some resilience that the country has, which also means that we have to be hopeful that there is always a possibility that it can be able to overcome its challenges. But the question, however, is how and through what, in what way. I don't think that Nigeria will be able to achieve its greatness or overcome its problems. So far, the kind of capitalist ruling elite that has been ruling the country for decades continue to rule it. And that's because the economic and political program that they have been ruling Nigeria with over the past 6 decades is one that has constantly ensured that the country is not able to achieve its full potential. Nigeria is a wealthy country by all standards. It's a country that should not have any business with poverty. And that's why even as a Nigerian, when you travel out of your country to other African countries regard us with some sense of pride. But unfortunately, we are a country where every backwardness that you can imagine in the world exists for us. There's no light, the roads are completely bad, hospitals are not working, our education system is crumbled, and Nigerians are now at a new level of desperation that, you now have what we call ritual killers, people who slaughter young women, and they perform rituals, claiming that through those rituals they can be able to get money out. I don't know, it's very crazy because obviously nothing like that exists, but it tells you the level of desperation that voodoo now is now taken as the only way for people to achieve some significance in life. And that's to tell you how far the 6 decades of the rule of the capitalist ruling elite has led the country into. We're at a point of no return. And that is why the only way forward, would be for us to do away with the same economic program that has led us to this junction. We need a different way of running society. And I have to say that why this is important is because it's become obvious now that the problem with Nigeria's oil industry is not just about stopping crude oil exportation to outside refineries, but it's a question of ensuring that we have local refinery capacity that is under the control of the government and that is democratically managed. And I will support this point with an example. Actually, over the past 1 month now, the Dangote refinery has become operational. But you'll be surprised that despite the fact that Dangote refinery has started distributing fuel product around filling stations across the country, yet that has not led to any drastic reduction in fuel price. Rather, over the past 1 month, fuel price in Nigeria has increased by another 300%. Wow. So, and then the question therefore is that why is Dangote refinery that is located within Nigeria not able to provide fuel product at a cheaper rate than fuel that is refined overseas? And the way Dangote has responded is this: he says that he is running an international refinery that is not producing for the local market. It is producing for the world market. So what that means is that it maintains the same international standard of pricing, which means that its product can be sold in Nigeria, it can be sold in Ghana, can also be sold in the UK and the United States.
Yeah, Hassan,
at the same rate. So
yeah, I would not like to cut you short, but I recall that Dangote had stated that they were going to come to some sort of agreement with the NNPC as far as coming to agree on the exchange rate of how much, what price we're going to sell these petroleum products. But away from that, Dangote had stated that the first batch which was given to NNPC was being sold at a price that was lower than what NNPC used to get from the international market. So how is that possible?
What they mean is this.
Yes.
The price they are giving is a bit lower than the international price, but when it comes to the pump price, the amount you buy it at the fuel pump, there is no difference. It's even higher.
Yeah,
because what is happening is that the government is still paying subsidy.
Yes.
Even though it claimed to have removed subsidy since last year, because with the way the currency has collapsed, what it means is that petrol is supposed to be selling for over 2,000 naira in Nigeria today. And the government knows that if that happens, then it will lead to a revolution. So they have been struggling to keep it below 1,000 naira. Right now, we are buying petrol for about 925 naira to 995 naira. But it also depends on the state. In some states, like Akwa Ibom State, for instance, they are buying fuel products at about 1,500 naira per liter. In Abuja, it is 995 naira per liter. In Lagos, it's about 926 naira per liter. The farther you are away from the port, the higher, fuel price becomes for you. So what has happened with Dangote product is that it's only a bit lower than the cost of the product imported from abroad, but at the pump price, it is not reflected. It's only reflected in the amount that the government has to pay for subsidy. So even for Dangote products, NNPC still has to pay a little bit of subsidy. And that's why the NNPC has insisted on being the only ones that takes the product and discharges it. So that at the end of the day, what you see is that Nigeria remains in a conundrum. Whether we are refining our fuel abroad or we are refining it within the country, the situation of ordinary people is that we are not able to get a product that can be seen under our soil, a product that is mined under our soil. We can't get it at a rate that is affordable. And what this means really is that the way our oil industry is being run, we are running the oil industry for profit. We are not running it for the purpose of servicing the needs of the people. And that is where the question really lies for Nigeria, but not just for Nigeria, for Cameroon, for other African countries. We need to ask the question, for us to develop, what should be the model, of running our society? Should it be for profit or for people's needs? So far, we continue to have the capitalist economic setup, whereby, the economy is run for the purpose of profit. There is no way we can be able to have the kind of development and progress that we need. Yes, Nigeria has a whole lot of wealth, our GDP is the highest, but, for vast majority of the population, it is a mystery and a starvation that is the order of the day. So what we need, and that is what we are clamoring for, is a different way of running Nigeria. We think that we need a socialist plan of our economy. We need to be able to sit down and say, what do we have as a country? We have crude oil, we have land that is very arable, we have water, we have ocean, we have a whole lot for us. How do we bring all of this together? We plan it to meet the needs of our people, to develop our society. That kind of planning, requires that the ordinary people, the working class, come to power. Because the problem with Nigeria is, part of the problem with Nigeria is also corruption. The ruling elites who are ruling the country, they don't have any interest in developing the country. What they are simply interested in is stealing the money. And that is why, despite the crisis we are talking about, the cost of living crisis, the starvation, the number of the rich people in this country continues the rich people continues to enjoy. I mean, for instance, just 5 people in this country today, Nigeria, they own more than 80% of the wealth of Nigeria. 5 billionaires in Nigeria have enough money that can wipe off the entire poverty and crisis that faces the entire country. So what we need to do, therefore, is to seize this wealth. We need to take this wealth off the 1%, and begin to utilize it to make life better for all. But this can only be possible on the basis of a revolution. And that is what you saw, for instance, partly in Senegal, where you had the uprising of the people that led to the coming to power of the new government. We need this kind of people's uprising, but on the basis of a clear and coherent program of ensuring that we put in power a workers and poor people's government. Because we don't want to replace one oppressor by another. What we need to replace the oppressing class with is the class of the common people, of African people, of the working class, ready to run the economy to meet with the needs of all. If this happens in Nigeria, you are going to be shocked at how Nigeria can be transformed within a few years. And obviously, if you have this kind of breakthrough in Nigeria, before you know, the Cameroonian people will also rise up and do the same. The people in Congo, the people in Ghana will do the same. And that is the only way we can be able to ensure that Africa, a country that is clearly swimming in an ocean of wealth, both natural and human, can be able to realize its true potential. Since the Berlin Conference, Africa has been subjugated both by internal and external colonizers. We need true liberation, and that's only possible on the basis of socialism.
Exactly what your co-panelists will say. Africa needs, or Nigeria needs to focus on this economic index. Now, away from that, we've seen Nigeria struggling with the issue of insecurity as well. But then, could you link these insecurity crisis or security challenges which Nigeria is going through to be affecting the, say, the current economy of the country?
Yes, that's exactly a point I think I forgot to make, because when you're talking about food prices now it has skyrocketed. It's not just a question, of the global situation or the removal of fuel subsidy. It is also because the major areas in Nigeria where food production really is concentrated is also the areas where you have had conflict and all kinds of violent crisis breaking out over the past period. So when you're talking about central Nigeria, when you're talking about states like Kogi, like Kaduna, you're talking about other states which are like Benue State, for instance, which are like the food basket of the nation. These are areas where you have had farmers and others clashes over the years, leading to thousands of people being killed. Many farmers are not able to go to farm. You also have a problem of banditry in all of these places. You have gangs of fighters who hide in the forest and they go about terrorizing villagers and extracting rent from them. They force villagers to pay protection money to them. Otherwise, they are going to go to the villages, ravage them, destroy them, kill people, slaughter them, and take over their farms. Then in states like Zamfara, for instance, you have the role of mining companies. Some of these companies are owned by Chinese entrepreneurs. Some of them are owned by local gangs who also precipitate violence between different villages in order to be able to drive away people from their land, because they know that those lands are actually rich in minerals. So they create this violence, this crisis, knowing that it will lead to people to migrate because of the crisis, and then they take over these areas and begin to mine gold and mine other resources. So you also have that kind of conflict breaking out in Zamfara, conflict that are linked to the interest of mining companies who just want to drive people away in order to take over their land and mine. And of course, you have the long-running Boko Haram conflict, which has taken place now for more than 1 decade in the northeastern part of Nigeria. Since it started in 2009, no Nigerian government since then has been able to resolve this crisis. Rather, the Boko Haram crisis continues actually to increase and expand. Right now, Boko Haram has broken out, it has splintered into so many groups. You have the ISIS, actually also having, a role to play. Now they have a franchise, in Nigeria, which has become one of the most effective fighting or militant group in the northeastern part of Nigeria today. And they continue to kidnap innocent people. They continue to attack schools, attack villagers and farms, and attack Nigerian soldiers. So in this sense, all of these conflicts have combined to create a situation whereby food production is not going on at a rate that can actually be able to ensure that you have adequate provision, of agricultural products. So with inadequacy comes increase in prices. But also, it's difficult for many farmers to be able to transport their products from their farms, to the cities, because the highways are not safe. The bandits and other violent groups operate on the highway. So drivers are not able to drive their trucks to convey food products from the countryside to the cities. And those who can do that, they charge a fortune, because it means that they would have to hire soldiers to follow them in order to protect the goods. And that means that all of these extra costs would also be reflected in food prices. So what this means, therefore, is that even if by a miracle Nigeria is able to resolve some of the food price hike that is connected to the role of fuel subsidy removal and other economic crisis, if government is able to solve all of this, that will not automatically lead to food prices coming down unless the problem of insecurity is resolved. For instance, now there are many local food products that are even much more expensive than the imported food product in Nigeria today because of this ongoing crisis. So that is actually a big issue right now for Nigeria, and it's part of the expanding socioeconomic crisis that faces the country. Because when you look at all of this violent conflict, we ask yourself, what are the sources of this conflict? They are connected to the climate crisis in Nigeria. They are connected to the ethnic and religious conflict in Nigeria. The fact that the Nigeria's ruling elite have been incapable, after 64 years of independence, to actually be able to build a united country where all Nigerians can see themselves as one. So that is also part of the reasons why you are having all of this crisis. So at the end of the day, you then realize that to solve any of the crises in Nigeria, whether economic, social, political, or environmental, you actually need a new system made up of new layers of people who are not interested in continuing the system of inequality and subjugation. We are interested in actually building a country that can grow harmoniously, not a country that is based on inequality, that is based on division.
Exactly, just in line with what you're saying, of course, Hassan. One of the activists of the protest in the person of the former, that's the 2023 presidential candidate, I got that correct, Sowore of the African Action Congress stated, and I quote, "Nigeria's independence starts now." Given that you're one of those that advocates for a revamp in the system in Nigeria, as well as bringing about a revolution, one that is going to change things, including reviving the country from its current economic problems. Now, what's your understanding of the statement?
Well, what it means is that what we have had over the past 64 years is an economic and political independence that does not actually elevate the Nigerian people from the slavery and subjugation they have been subjected to over the decades. So more or less, it is a paper independence. Nigeria still remains, the footstool of global imperialist powers. Nigeria still remains the footstool of IMF and World Bank, and that's why you have the enormous debt that Nigeria is owing today. These are debts that are collected from international banks and financial institutions, but they are not reflected in development or infrastructures in Nigeria. These debts are just stolen between the Nigerian government as well as the imperialist backers and the multinational companies. So in a sense, you have a country, that both multinational companies, the imperialism, as well as the Nigeria's ruling elite, they continue to steal from in so many ways. So there is that criminal connivance between the local compradors and the imperialist powers to continue to loot the resources of the country, to continue to ruin the country. So what we need to do to actually achieve real independence in the truest sense of the word is for the Nigerian people to rise up against the local compradors and the imperialist backers. That is the only way that true independence and true freedom, can be born for Nigeria, but also, for the entire Africa, because the same situation you have in Nigeria is replicated in 1,000 ways across the African continent, whether in Cameroon or Ghana and all of that. There's no place in Africa where the African people is dealing with one enemy. We are dealing with two-class enemies, our local comprador and also the imperialist backer. So that essentially, the struggle of the Nigerian people, the struggle of the Cameroonian people, the struggle of the African people is both a local struggle and an international resistance. It means that we have to struggle against the local compradors in order to overthrow them and take over the running of our country. But we know that as soon as we do that, the imperialist backers are going to come to defend them. You are going to find them rolling in the tanks to want to drown the revolution in blood. And that is why the Nigerian working people, the Cameroonian working people, the Ghanaian working people, must be prepared that alongside with the uprising, to overthrow our own local compradors, must also be an uprising to fight the imperialist backers, to defeat the imperialist backers and to ensure that they are not able to subjugate us. So in that sense, our struggle and our revolution is both an African revolution and an international revolution, because if the global order of capitalism and imperialism is not defeated, there is no way that either Africa or Latin America or the neo-colonial world can be truly free. So freedom for Africa actually has an international connotation. It means freedom of the entire humanity under the banner of socialism.
Absolutely, and some of these points which you've cited actually resonates with what's happening across the African continent. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over For You Media Africa. Of course, you're watching us on For You Television, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3, and we're streaming live on our social media platforms. Meanwhile, we're discussing Nigeria, what's happening in the West African country. We're asking the question, why is Nigeria's economy crumbling? This part of numerous calls for the federal government to be able to address the challenges. And of course, with our guests this day, we're trying to understand what needs to be done, paving the way forward. And of course, that leads me to the last question for today with you, Hassan Soweto. Now, paving the way forward for the West African country, what would you suggest the Nigerian government and the stakeholders that should be able to take into consideration while putting the interests of Nigerians first?
Sorry, come again. There was a glitch. Sorry.
Yes, I was asking that while we're advocating for Nigeria or change to come to the West African country, what would you advise or solicit the stakeholders to be able to take into consideration as suggestions while taking the country of Nigeria forward, while putting the interests of the country at heart?
Okay, well, I'm struggling to understand the question, but let me answer it in this way, which is that for us to be able to liberate Nigeria, we need to have to build a movement that is united and that has clear objectives. Part of the tragedy of the Nigerian situation is that despite the enormity of the crisis that we have in terms of the cost of living crisis, in terms of the neoliberal attacks on the lives of the common people.
Yes, San, are you with us? In just a few words, could you tell us your way forward for the West African country? Okay, hopefully unfortunately we lost Hassan Soweto, who was joining us all the way from Nigeria. But in his words, he stated that it's time for the Nigerian people as well as the stakeholders or powers that be to be able to take the interests and powers of what's happening in the West African country into their hands for the development of their nation. Meanwhile, we would be concluding today's edition of Talking Points. I would like to acknowledge the presence of our guests this day. Of course, we had Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist economist, as well as CEO of CROSTON FINTECH, and we just had HASSAN TAIWO, who joined us all the way from Lagos in Nigeria in his capacity as a national coordinator for Education's Rights Campaign. Meanwhile, as we were discussing in the course of today's edition of Talking Point, we believe you learned a lot from today's conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your keen attention. I'll leave you in the company of numerous programs over your Pan-African channel. Bye-bye.